Well, I just want to say welcome, everyone. Another great turnout, and I know we'll have others coming in a little later. I'm Larry Ricketts, and for the lawyers in the group and others, I'll let you know we're recording this session. We're gathering to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the oldest college alumni association in the world. It's simply amazing that is the truth. We're also celebrating and hope to celebrate together our 55th next year. And I can tell you, to me, I don't know about you guys, that is also absolutely amazing. And we're also gathering so that we can share stories of our classmates and hear some of their expertise. So on this Earth Day, we're going to hear from our classmate, Jon Cannon, who was motivated by the first Earth Day in 1970 to enter the field of environmental law. And from the Williams Alumni magazine, I can say, Jon, echoes truly do rebound. Before I introduce Jon, there's a few housekeeping details. First of all, I hope you all know where your refrigerator is and your lavatories are, because I can't tell you where they are in your houses, so I won't. However, you should know that you're all going to be muted during Jon's presentation, and we ask you not to chat or comment during the time he's presenting. It's sort of bothersome. We'll have plenty of time afterwards. When we come back from breakouts, you'll be free to ask questions and unmute. However, please keep muted and use the raised hand function of Zoom. When called upon to ask a question or make a comment, you may unmute at that time. For those of you that have not used the raised hand function of Zoom, you'll find it by clicking on the participants button on the tab if you're on a computer at the bottom of your screen. Some of you may have it on the reaction tab. If you're using an iPad or iPhone, you'll find it under the 3-dot More section on the screen. Of course, you can always use the chat function when we come back for questions after the breakouts. So Jon Cannon went to law school at the University of Pennsylvania. Beginning in 1976, Jon had a number of positions at the Environmental Protection Agency. He ended up as general counsel for the EPA, and during that time wrote an opinion that backstopped the famous Supreme Court decision in Massachusetts versus the EPA. That decision opened the door to climate change regulation under the Clean Air Act. Jon is presently the Blaine T. Phillips Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law at the University of Virginia Law School. Jon gets enough accolades in the environmental law field and in academia, so my introduction at his request has been a bit informal. To me, the important aspects of Jon Cannon are his love of nature, family, running, biking, and kayaking. In addition, Jon is a writer, and in his retirement coming in May, just next month, I look forward to him sending me some of his poetry. Another humble Renaissance classmate. Jon will speak to us on Can Law Keep Up with Climate Change? So Professor Cannon, you're on. Don't forget to unmute yourself, Jon.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Larry. Now I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this won't take long. Okay, looks good. Can everybody see it? Everybody good? Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me to this. It's really gratifying to have the chance to talk to people I've known for a long time and spent important years together with about something that is important to me now. And I've spent a fair amount of my recent years talking about and teaching. And that's climate change. I think it's great to have the opportunity to do this on Earth Day, the 51st Earth Day. I'm wearing green in commemoration. So in addition to all the other landmarks that Larry mentioned, we have a day honoring the Earth, and I hope that stays fresh in people's minds and maybe even gets stronger as we go. So the title that I picked was "Can Law Keep Up with Climate Change?" But that's really not the right title. It should be "Can Law Get Ahead of Climate Change?" Because right now, greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, not falling. They need to be leveling out and declining in order to achieve climate stability at levels that avoid dangerous impacts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the phenomenon of anthropogenic climate change. I'm not a scientist. I'm sure there are folks among you who know more about the science than I do, but we need to have a common understanding of the science to understand what the challenges are from a legal and a policy standpoint, because the structure of the climate change problem is really crucial to coming up with effective legal and policy solutions. So 3 factors control the climate, probably more than that, but I'm going to focus on 3. The energy coming from the sun comes to the earth. It is either reflected by light surfaces like ice and sent back into space, and therefore isn't absorbed by the earth, or it's absorbed by the earth and then re-radiated as infrared radiation into the atmosphere. Now, some of that energy that's re-radiated goes into space, but some of it is trapped by the atmosphere. And the components of the atmosphere that perform that function are greenhouse gases, which serve to as an opaque shield, if you will, to this radiation, and sends that radiation back to Earth so it doesn't escape into space. The higher the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, the more pronounced is that effect, and therefore the higher the percentage of heat that goes back and is reabsorbed in the earth. So the linchpin of anthropogenic climate change is that atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases are increasing due to human activity, right? And this is, I hope this is as complicated as this gets, because this is about the limits of my numerical skills, but this is a balance or a budget, a carbon budget for the year 2015, just to pick a recent year, that shows how this increase is happening. So to the left, try to get my pointer here, these left 2 columns are sources of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels primarily, and then an additional quantum from land use change, particularly deforestation, which takes the carbon that's stored in the forests and makes that available. So if you add those up, that's roughly 11.2 gigatons of carbon on that side. On the other side, that is what happens to these emissions. Some are taken up by the ocean, some are taken up by the land, and therefore don't reach the atmosphere. That's about 5 gigatons. But the rest goes into the atmosphere as representing an additional increment of greenhouse gases attributable to human activity, and that happens on a yearly basis. And it's been happening more or less since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So now our concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere are about 417 parts per million. Before the Industrial Revolution, there were about 280 parts per million. So about a 50% increase. And as I emphasize, that increase is continuing, right? And what that means is as atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases rise, more energy is entering the Earth than is leaving. That increases the Earth's internal energy and warming occurs. And that warming will occur until there is no net increase in carbon going into the atmosphere, so that the energy going out comes to equal the energy going in, and you get stability at some level. It may be a much higher surface temperature than we have now, but at some level, assuming no net emissions of carbon due to human activity, we will have a stable atmosphere and eventually a stable climate, right? So that's the physical structure of the problem. Why is that important? Because it dictates the kind of problem that this is. And this is the kind of problem that generally referred to in policy circles as a tragedy of the commons. This is a tragedy of the global commons. And this is, the narrative goes like this. A ton of carbon dioxide emitted in Charlottesville, where I am, has the same effect on climate as a ton of carbon emitted in Shanghai, say. And that's because carbon that's emitted anywhere on Earth mixes well with other carbon dioxide and creates a uniform level of, or concentration of, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But so that means that the benefits of reductions, if I reduce a ton of carbon emitted in Charlottesville, the benefits of that reduction are dispersed globally, right? But if I reduce a ton of carbon in Charlottesville, I'm going to incur all the costs of reducing that ton of greenhouse gas emissions. I have to buy a more expensive electric car, or I do something else, but I incur the costs. So the individual, in the case I've given, or a nation, if you sort of generalize this to the national level, will incur higher costs to reduce carbon emissions than they will experience benefits. And that means there are limited incentives for parties, individuals, or nations to take action unless they're assured that everybody else on the globe, or most everybody else on the globe that's emitting carbon, will also reduce emissions. And of course, if they're assured that everybody else is going to reduce their emissions, then they might be tempted to free ride, since if they don't reduce emissions, it's probably not going to change the result much. So you have this, this strange collective action problem, not so strange, fairly common collective action problem, where the rational result would be for everybody to reduce emissions, but based on individual calculations, cost-benefit calculations, individuals or single nations don't have the incentives to do that. So that's the basic problem. And then it's complicated in the case of climate change by a bunch of factors, which I'll just rehearse briefly here. These are features that make the collective action problem even more serious in the case of climate change. There are billions of sources all over the globe, right? And as I say, each of those sources can contribute to the global problem. The greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere have a long hang time. Carbon is up there for 100 years or more. And what that means is that the effect of my emissions of a ton of carbon, for example, is experienced not only during my lifetime, but in the lifetime of people to come Conditions of climate stability, net zero emissions, as I said before, impose a significant constraint. There is scientific uncertainty, not so much in terms of the basic model of climate change that I've presented, but in terms of how quickly climate change is going to progress in the future, how much more we will emit in the way of greenhouse gases, and how the temperature of the Earth will respond to those emissions. And then there's a problem of unequal contributions and impacts. The United States and other large developed countries have contributed historically to the current levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and continue to contribute large quantities. Smaller nations, less developed nations have contributed much less. And they may also be more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. A good example is the Maldives, right? They've contributed almost nothing to the current situation that's driving global warming. But because of their status as an island nation, they face immense consequences as a result. The policy implications, the complications flowing from these features, billions of sources mean dispersed causation, which means a very hard time to coordinate the reductions of all these sources. Long hang time means intergenerational effects. Not only are we externalizing costs on other people when we emit carbon, but we're externalizing costs on people that aren't even living, our grandchildren, to be specific. Conditions of climate stability create a problem because they mean nothing less than the transformation of the current energy system, which represents a huge investment, very difficult to turn or transform in a short period of time. Scientific uncertainty leads to debatable goals. How much, how soon should we reduce? And then these inequalities and contributions and impacts produce a lot of debates about who's responsible, who should pay, who should act, and those carry into the policy debates and the legal solutions. So we have a recognizable problem, collective action problem. Law's job, one of the law's jobs is to coordinate collective responses to solve those problems. But the structure and these features of climate change make that challenge particularly daunting. So we might hope for an international law at the international level to address this problem. It's a global problem, right? It's global in scope. The nations are mutually responsible, and therefore you would hope that they would undertake a mutual solution. At the global level, because there's no global legislature, there's no global police force, that solution has to be through negotiation, through voluntary agreement to some sort of treaty or other agreement that would begin to have effect on individual nations' behavior. We have such a thing, or at least we have the beginnings of such a thing in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which begins to outline, and this is really what it does, begins to outline the terms on which the global community, the international community, might begin to address this problem. It says, for example, that the goal of the international community is to prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. And the obligation of each nation is to prevent or minimize the causes of global warming. And it also announces this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which tries to capture this equity problem that I talked about before. But the But this agreement is a framework agreement. It doesn't tell you what is a dangerous interference with the climate system. It doesn't tell you what each nation must do to prevent or minimize, or even how the nations would go about figuring out what they should do. And it doesn't specify what the common but differentiated responsibilities should be. So what's necessary then is some next step that implements this framework and begins to put a gloss on it that creates some constraints, some real operative constraints on the parties. And that's what the world community, or some parts of the world community, attempted to do in the Kyoto Protocol, which was negotiated in 1995 and included quantified emissions reductions for developed countries. And those were in the form of reductions, percent reductions in greenhouse gas emissions below a certain baseline. But an important feature of this document is that there were no reduction targets for developing countries. This was thought to implement the common but differentiated responsibilities principle. But that becomes a problem for reasons that I'll talk about in just a minute. The United States never became a party. So even for some developed countries, turns out for most developed countries, this agreement didn't represent a binding solution. The protocol was never submitted to the US Senate for ratification because the Senate said in advance, by an almost unanimous vote, it wouldn't ratify it. And in fact, it was repudiated during the Bush administration in 2001, and then later abandoned by other developed countries. So it was clear from the response and the effectiveness of that document that something else had to be done. And that something else had to include some engagement with developing countries to have them undertake emissions reductions also. And you can see why that's true. And this is, as of 2018, more than half of the global emissions, CO2 emissions, were from developing countries. That is, countries that weren't assigned limitations under the Kyoto Protocol. And those are the emissions that have been growing in recent years. You can see this. China's emissions have grown hugely. It is now it has taken over from the United States as the leading emitter of greenhouse gases, but India is up there too, other developing nations. So it became clear that whatever the agreement was, whatever the arrangement was, it couldn't leave developing countries out of it. So heading into the Paris Agreement, Todd Stern, who is the lead US negotiator, also a lawyer, set forth three principles that had to be implemented. One, we had to replace the top-down approach. That is, the specified quantitative reductions that were set forth in the Kyoto Protocol. Why did we have to replace them? Because countries wouldn't sign an agreement that had them. The United States would not sign an agreement that had them. So that was just a matter of pragmatic judgment. The second thing was to shift the paradigm of differentiation. That is, to include the developing countries in whatever arrangement was developed. And then his third principle was build a long-term. That's have an agreement that kept going on and didn't have a decisive date for ending, so that nations would get used to this process as one of continual improvement until we could meet our goals. And that those principles are embedded now in the Paris Agreement, which for the first time in one of these international agreements states a global goal of no greater than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels worldwide. That is, our goal is to keep increases in temperature, in the Earth's surface temperature, below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Actually, there's an aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, but people are skeptical that we have a realistic chance of doing that. So what is the structure of this agreement? How does it work? Well, it works through a system of promise and review. There are no legally enforceable requirements in this agreement as we would understand them. It's based on voluntary undertakings by each country, which are transparently submitted, and then a systematic process for monitoring and reporting on what the countries actually accomplish, right? And in this case, the voluntary undertakings by the country are called nationally determined contributions. They are prepared by each country, submitted to the conference of the agreement, and updated every 5 years with the expectation, although it's not a legal requirement, that each update will represent increased ambition, right? Todd Stern's idea is that by making this system transparent and having these plans reported and the results reported, there will be a system of increased ambition, that rising norms and expectations will drive the global community toward ever more stringent action in order to achieve this overall goal. There's also this global stocktake, which occurs, which is basically a global review of how we're doing, and that's supposed to feed back into the nation's determinations of their contributions. How are we doing? Well, we're not there yet. So this is a complicated graph, but basically it represents projected increases in global temperatures through 2100, the end of this century, based on various scenarios. Current policies would put us at about 3 degrees Celsius or more above pre-industrial levels. Increases that most scientists think would begin to have catastrophic results. Pledges and targets that have developed in response to the Paris Agreement would get us down to about 2.6 degrees Celsius, assuming those targets were actually met, right? And then you see, in order to achieve 2 degrees Celsius, we need a lower trajectory. That is, we need a more stringent set of reductions. Whether we can get there or not, whether ambition increases over time, then really depends on the actions of individual countries making their submissions. And this is what leads people to say that climate change under the system is a multi-level game. There's a game going on at the international level, and then there are multiple games going on within each domestic setting, right? Biden is trying to get the United States together to make a more ambitious, nationally determined contribution, and that process is going on all over. And there's also discussion between and among countries, between the United States and China, for example, trying to encourage each other to move the process. So for the United States, what are the legal instruments that exist or might exist to bring us to a point of being a reliable and constructive contributor to this international effort? The economists argue that what we need is a price on carbon, that is, some set amount that would be charged to the emitter for each ton of carbon emitted to the atmosphere. And that could be done either through a carbon tax or through a cap and trade system where there would be a total cap on emissions, and emissions allowances would be able to be traded among emitters and produce effectively a market price for carbon. We had a shot at such a thing in the first Obama administration. The Waxman Markey bill was a cap and trade bill which covered most of the large stationary sources in the country. It had a pretty stringent goal of 83% reduction by 2050 and a provision for emission allowance trading, which made it meet the economist's criterion of efficiency. It passed the House of Representatives, but it didn't pass the Senate. So we don't have a price on carbon. We don't have a comprehensive piece of climate change legislation. I think the estimates of the likelihood of that happening in the current political climate are pretty slim. So we're left with a kind of a grab bag of existing statutes and other legal avenues that that are the tools available to any administration that wants to move quickly on this or effectively on this. The Clean Air Act is the main tool. Larry mentioned Massachusetts v. EPA, which is a case decided by the Supreme Court, which held that greenhouse gas emissions were among the air pollutants that EPA could regulate under this statute, which was enacted way back in 1970. And it also said that in making the determination whether to regulate, the agency was required to consider whether these emissions, these greenhouse gas emissions, would endanger human health and welfare, and in so doing, it had to rely on the science. That came down in the George W. Bush administration. The Bush administration didn't do anything with it, but when Obama came in, his administration took the Clean Air Act seriously and attempted to apply this holding and regulate a number of the key sectors responsible for greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Here are those sectors. We see in the United States, by sector, greenhouse gas emissions are attributable primarily to the electric utility sector, fossil fuel plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, 30%. Transportation, 26%. Your car, my car, heavy duty trucks. And then assorted industrial sources make up another 21%. But you see, if you could get electricity and transportation, you would get at more than half of the emissions in the United States. And that's where the Obama administration focused its efforts under the Clean Air Act and came up with, just ignore the Trump rule here for a minute and we'll focus on the good news. It produced a car rule or a set of car rules that reduced vehicle emissions of greenhouse gases by 5% a year from 2021 to 2016, or from 2012 to 2016. It produced a rule for fossil fuel fired electric generating units that required a 32% reduction by 2030. And it also set standards for some other industrial operations, including oil and gas operations that produce methane. Methane is a less plentiful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it's very powerful. So these were important. I'm getting my chat. So how much time do I have, Kate? 5 minutes. Oh God. Okay, so what happened? I mean, you all know what happened. Trump gets elected and systematically rolls back these rules that were adopted in the Obama administration. So the car rules, instead of 5% a year, are 1.5% a year reduction. And it's not clear that even that the automobile industry was in support of that. From 32% in the electric utility industry down to 0.5%, maybe. It's not clear that there would be any significant reductions. And the methane standards were rescinded. New president, He's trying to put back the broken china with various new proposals. But what this political cycling has meant is that there is no stable national policy. We withdrew from Paris. Biden's trying to put together a new plan, trying to regain credibility on the international stage. But what happens when the next administration comes in? And in the absence of any comprehensive climate change legislation, there really isn't a platform to build and sustain the kind of national program that we need. I'm going to skip, there are some other measures that could be available and that Biden may try to take advantage of, but I'm going to skip sort of to the closing point here. I've talked about national legislation primarily, but there's also work going on at the states. California has a very ambitious climate change program, a cap and trade program, AB 32, which is producing significant reductions and may serve as a model for future programs if the nation decides that it wants to adopt them. Localities, many of you live in places, cities where the city has undertaken to mitigate climate change. The city has the ability through transportation infrastructure, through changes in urban form to affect the level of emissions that occur as a result of urbanized living. The cities also, localities also are in a position to address the need to adapt to climate change that's already occurring. I've talked about climate change as a global problem. It is a global problem in its genesis. That is, the emissions that contribute to climate change have to be considered at a global level. But the effects of climate change are different from place to place. And therefore, responding to those effects and trying to avoid those effects is more a function of the locality, the place, which is actually seeing these effects. So you get at the local level attention to mitigation, but also to adaptation. Do we build a flood wall? Do we change the highway? Do we build protective structures around our subway so it doesn't get flooded at high tide, and so on and so forth? And in the questions, I've suggested we think about the local aspects of this problem as well as the global aspects. So we have some legal structures in place at the international level. Not clear how well they're going to work, but we have some hopes. At the domestic level, I think we don't have all the tools that we need. We have some tools that can be used. Hopefully those can be marshaled in an effective way, and ultimately we'll have some comprehensive legislation. And then we have these encouraging developments, at least in some states and localities. So the law hasn't quite caught up with climate change yet, but maybe it will soon. So
thanks, John.
That's it.
Thanks, John. You can stop the screen sharing.
Okay. So how did I do, Kate, on time? Was I? Is that right?
You did very well.
Perfect.
You did very well.
Okay.
I might say how impressed I am, but I also can say how depressed I am, John.
That was my goal. I mean, look, guys, this is not a happy story. I can't make it a happy story.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to breakouts, and two things. If you find yourself in a breakout room alone, or would like to come back to the main room, simply look for the Leave Breakout Room button at the bottom, and you can come back to the main room, and Kate can reassign you, or if you're alone, she can put you in another room. Jon Cannon and I will be moderators in breakout rooms, in addition to John Vipon, John Huffnagel, Ellen Stern, Harry Tether, and Ken Wilcox. If one of these folks is not in your room, you can either have chaos or appoint someone to host or moderate. It's up to you. Or just chat among yourselves. And John has given me 3 questions that you might consider in your talk among yourselves. One is local, as John said. What is happening surrounding climate change in your state and your community? And how would you rate its likely effectiveness? This is quite interesting, I think, for us. The next is the national question. Will the US be able to establish an effective, stable climate change policy in the current political climate? What might give some hope for that? So the national one is effective on the national scale, and what's your hopes? And finally, the international one, he poses a quick question to us. What is your level of confidence that the parties to the Paris Agreement will increase their ambition to meet the 2-degree goal? How might that happen? So any one of you, if you're interested, you can pick anyone, local, national, or international, or you can talk about all 3, whatever interests you. And then we'll come back in about 15 to 16 minutes. And we'll open it up for questions that are either is in your group or you might have individually. If you don't know how to raise a Zoom hand, Kate and I will try to call on you as you do it. And hopefully Kate will see, or I'll see if I'm blocked out of my space here now. I'm going to try to see.
Okay, it looks like we
There we
already have
go.
a couple hands.
I got it. Under the participants, I think your hand will go up in order. So we have a question from Van Hawn. Van, if you unmute yourself and go ahead.
It's not a question. I want to congratulate John on his work and say I'm proud to be an alumnus of the University of Virginia Law School, and I'm proud to be on board.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm not an alumnus of UVA, but I'm proud to be here. It's a great institution.
Paul Lipoff, you're next. If you unmute, go ahead.
Okay. John, I have a couple of factual questions or scientific questions.
Sure.
Where are we now in terms relative to the plus 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels?
Well, we're about 1 degree centigrade above.
Okay.
So we have some space, but the projections I showed you suggest that if we continue as we do, business as usual, by 2100, we'll have broken the bank on 2 degrees.
Right. Now, the way the science works, suppose we froze our greenhouse gas emissions at current levels, just by magic or by whatever, right. and we continued creating greenhouse gases at the current rate, but no greater. Would the temperature remain stable?
No. See, that's the really crucial challenge here. We can't just level off, because right now at the current levels, we're adding to the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And as we continue to add, the warming pressure increases. So if we leveled off, we might be better off than if we continued to increase emissions, but we wouldn't have stabilized the climate. We wouldn't have created conditions under which the climate can be stable. To do that, we need to achieve no net emissions. That is, no additional emissions attributable to human activity that aren't netted out by a sink, like the ocean or the forest.
I'm going to call on Rich Gearman next,
Thank
and then Ted McPherson had a question he sent in before we began. So I'm going to Rich, and then we'll go to you, Ted, next. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there are any potential technological solutions in the pipeline, you know, if not a silver bullet, something that can at least help with the emissions. Someone mentioned burning methane, or, you know, I'm not sure, something that goes in the atmosphere and eats up carbon
Right.
monoxide or something like that.
So there are, I mean, there are various technologies that are being looked at, including geoengineering options. So, you know, one idea is to put reflective shields in the atmosphere to increase the albedo and reflect more of the light of the sun back to space. There are other proposals to fertilize the ocean to increase the growth of algae, which absorbs carbon dioxide. And if you can find some way to sequester that carbon dioxide at the bottom of the ocean or somewhere, that could be that could increase the sink effect, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. The challenge with a number of these technologies is that they can be implemented by a single actor, like a single country could put up reflective shields that would have a global impact. And that might be done, you know, inadvisably in a way that has an impact that we don't like. So the political problem of regulating those technologies is pretty daunting, and has made people say, well, if we have to, we'll get there, but let's try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through these more conventional means first.
Ted McPherson.
Hey, John, thanks very much for your good work in this important area. Since, as you point out, it's difficult to legislate, negotiate, or promise behavior,
Yeah.
how does one practically create a continuity of purpose for achieving valuable results in global climate change? As is illustrated by our space program and the NASA continuity of purpose over 10 years to go to the moon, how do you get a continuity of purpose in this global issue to produce real results?
Yeah. So that's really putting your finger on the crux of it, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think the comparison to the NASA program is interesting because we have had a program that is sustainable over time and been highly successful. But my perception would be that the NASA program is much less divisive politically, and therefore much less likely to be subject to the kind of political vacillation that we've seen in the climate change arena. And then you have to produce that continuity, not just at the national level, but at the international level. I think it can be done, but it's going to take a while to do it. And what's going to happen is the development of trust and reciprocal behavior on the part of major emitters at the global level. And I can't predict whether that will happen. I'm hopeful that it will, but I think that's a bet that the Paris Agreement is making that's not, that's still uncertain.
I think you're right, because the peaceful coexistence with some of those rivals and large emitters in our lifetime, remaining lifetime, is a huge challenge. And without that trust that you refer to, it's simply going to default to a competition where everyone's self-interests will be preeminent.
Right. And then the free rider problem just destroys whatever collective approach that you can take.
We've got 4 hands up. Brian, you're next. Try to keep it crisp so we can get to the other 3.
Yeah, my question has to do with the international scene. If I were in India or China, I'd be saying our per capita emissions are way, way lower than the US. What are you beating on us for? How much does this enter into the perspective, enter into the international negotiations?
it defines the international negotiations, or it has up to this point. So the argument of the developing countries like India is, first of all, we're not as advanced economically. Our per capita income is lower. And the reason we have a climate change problem today is because you wealthy countries have used fossil fuels to develop your economies and be wealthy. We should have the same chance in order to make things equal. So you guys go ahead and reduce your emissions, and we'll catch up with you at some point. And when we do, then we'll talk about reducing our emissions. That's it. I mean, that's a caricature, but that's basically, that has been historically the position. Now, what the Paris Agreement did was at least eliminate the hard line between developing and developed countries. But that mindset is going to affect, it has to affect what the developing countries choose to submit in their nationally determined contributions.
Andy Parnes, you're up next.
Let me ask you a legal question. Are there any cases percolating around in the courts that would challenge the EPA's authority, on the one hand, to do federal regulations? And are there cases, on the other hand, where you have states like California that are advancing in the, are more advanced than the federal policies, and keeping them from doing that? Are there any cases out there that you're worried about?
Well, yeah. So all of the regulations that get adopted under the Clean Air Act addressing greenhouse gases are litigated. And they're litigated as, under the standard administrative law principles of courts look at them to see whether the agency has acted within its legal authority and to see whether the agency has acted in a reasonable way based on the record before it. So that kind of review will continue, whether the administration is pro-climate or anti-climate. A lot of Trump's rules have not survived judicial review. I think their success rate is about 20%, which is unusually low for an administration. So that litigation continues. California has its own legal regime, which is much more assertive than the federal regime with the cap and trade system, and that has survived judicial review in that state, and is just a very robust example of what's possible if you have the political will to accomplish. There have been some other cases based on common law theories, public nuisance and so forth, cases against oil companies trying to obtain damages for climate change. And those common law cases have not fared well in the courts. The courts just don't want to put themselves in a position of determining what they think is national policy on a major issue through judicial fiat. They're just not going to go there.
Okay, with respect to your time, we're going to take two more questions that hands have been up. We have Ken Wilcox, and then Greg Meister is going to end. But I will tell you that after we're through, for those of you that have to leave, we say goodbye, and I'll tell you what's coming up next. But those that want to stay, the college is nice enough to say they'll keep this open for just general conversation for 15 minutes afterwards. So Ken, your question.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, John, for doing this, going to the effort to put this together for us, because it was really enlightening and also great to see you and everybody else. So yeah. Thanks to everybody for joining in too. My problem with this is it seems, and I think the challenge is, to me, it seems there's an imbalance between the benefit and the cost. Yeah. The cost is very real and right in front of us, either in expense or dislocation or whatever. And the benefits are kind of out there.
Right.
So
right.
How do we bring that together? And as Rick Ackley said, maybe things have to get worse before they can get better, Well,
I mean, that may be the case. I think you're exactly right. The costs seem because the costs are dispersed globally, we don't see them. We see the effects of climate change, but You know, psychologically, we're not connecting that with what we do, the choices we make, because the choices we make individually have no effect, virtually, because the effects are globalized. So it doesn't matter. I mean, if I get an electric vehicle, the climate of the world is not going to respond to that one iota, not measurable, not even close to measurable.
John, in our group, Al Gortz, who lives down there on the coast of Florida, said, you know, when they're going to come to realization,
Yeah.
when their homes go into the ocean,
Yeah.
then they might do something.
Yeah.
Greg, you're next. You're up.
Thank you, John, for this very compelling presentation. I really appreciate it. You said at the very outset that we need to have a common understanding of the science, and I'm sure you meant that as a nation we need to have that.
Right.
In fact, we don't have that.
Right.
And we have, not to put too fine a point on it, we have one party, the Republican Party, that doesn't accept the science pretty much at all, or they have an alternative view of that science. And some of them can make a very compelling case, I think, that their science is different or better or whatever. So given all that, what will it really take, other than massive floods, in this very partisan age, what do you think it might take to really move the needle?
So that's a good question. And, you know, my view about the science is that the science is pretty clear, but when people talk about climate science in a political setting, they're not talking about the science at all. They're talking about whether you have a conservative viewpoint or a liberal viewpoint, because those viewpoints are so deeply enmeshed in a position that isn't based on any, I mean, I haven't done an independent review of all the scientific studies. I get my science from synthetic reports that are done by expert panels and so forth. So I think the science dispute is a symptom, not a cause of the political polarization. And if you could find some way to begin to create some new connections politically, I think you're going to see that kind of resistance dissolve. But I have no secret for resolving the political polarization. I think that's a deeper structural problem right now.
Okay, I want to respect your time, everyone. On May 20th, Rich Gearman will speak about his experience creating the nonprofit Safe Passage for Children in Minnesota. Safe Passage advocates for child protection and foster care programs in Minnesota. And thanks to Rich and his work, it's become a model for child welfare in the nonprofit world. Ken Wilcox, who was mayor there in Minnesota, will be your moderator. And now the college will keep this session open for those who want to stay. I'll try, if you want to raise your hand again and make a comment or talk to somebody, I'll try to be the moderator if enough stay. And to those leaving, on behalf of your class officers, I can't thank you enough. John, I can't thank you, and Kate, you and the college deserve our undying thanks for all your work on our behalf. So thank you. Good night to those that have to go, and those that are staying. Let's see.
Great to join you all. Really enjoyed it.